It's looking like World War III is about to break out right now. And everybody's talking about what's happening in Venezuela, but I think we might be missing the full picture of why this is happening. I got my sweater on proper today, by the way. So the US just completely took over Venezuela.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
And the US is talking about making moves on the rest of the region.
Colombia is producing a lot of drugs. They have cocaine factories that they make cocaine, as you know, and they sell it right into the United States. So he better wise up, or he'll be next. He'll be next, too. And I hope he's listening. He's going to be next.
Is the Cuban government the Trump administration's next target, Mr. Secretary? Very quickly.
Well, the Cuban government is a huge problem. Yeah, the Cuban government is a huge problem. First of all,
so is that a yes?
Cuba, but I don't think people fully appreciate. I think they're in a lot of trouble. Yes, I'm not going to talk to you about what our future steps are going to be and our policies are going to be right now in this regard, but I don't think it's any mystery that we are not big fans of the Cuban regime.
The cartels are running Mexico. She's not running Mexico. The cartels are running Mexico. And we could be politically correct and be nice and say, oh, yes, she is. No, she's very, she's very frightened of the cartels. They're running Mexico. And I've asked her numerous times, would you like us to take out the cartels? No, Mr. President. No, please. So we have to do something because something's going to have to be done with Mexico.
And we need to talk about what this really means for the rest of the world, because China has also responded to what's happened and has asked for the release of President Maduro. And I think that's worth noting. So yes, Venezuela does have the largest oil reserve in the world. And it'd be really easy to just stop there and say that that's the only reason that the US is there. But we also have to think about, why is the US making that move right now? So I'm going to break down for you why I think this conflict is happening right now, how it is exactly that we got here in the past, and what this means for you and your money. First, to understand the full context of what's actually happening right now and how we're at the point where we're just on the brink of World War III, well, we need to go back in time to World War II, and honestly back to World War I. So before World War I, the world ran on what's called a classical gold standard. And how it worked was essentially currencies were directly convertible into gold. So you had the pounds, Swiss francs, Deutsche marks, and dollars were worth fixed weights of gold, all in their own economies. And so in this time, gold could move freely across borders, and money supply was constrained, right? You can only issue as much money as you had gold to back it. And then World War I started. And what did countries immediately do? They said, hey, we're gonna stop the convertibility of gold. So you suspend the convertibility of gold, but why do you do that? Well, because the next step is we need to start printing money. You can't finance a war if you can't print money. And you can't print money on a gold standard. So you had these massive bond issuances and countries borrowing both from themselves and also from each other. And so when this happened, you also had huge inflation coming up in many countries. And really, in effect, the gold standard of that time had died in 1914. But no one wanted to admit that yet. So then you fast forward, and then after World War I, the world experienced a Great Depression. In America, 25% of the workforce, meaning 1 out of every 4 Americans, was out of work. In Germany, you saw unemployment soaring above 30% by 1932. And then also in 1932, you had an estimated 30 million people that were unemployed around the world. You know, world trade fell by 40 to 60% in the early 1930s. And in the US, you saw thousands of banks just completely fail and people's savings be wiped out. The thing about war is that it leads to temporary, unnatural states of an economy, right? What happens after that is those unnatural forces in the economy start to unwind, and that can be very painful. For instance, during a war, governments spend money. They spend far more than normal. They're going to be buying weapons, ships, uniforms, fuel, food. And during these times, factories, for instance, will be running nonstop. And you will also have unemployment getting really low because the country needs people working to do jobs that are necessary for war. But then after a war, all that military spending and defense spending will collapse. and a lot of different transactions are just going to disappear overnight. And factories are going to lose their biggest customer, right? And then for the losers of the war, their country and its infrastructure have just been completely decimated. And now keep in mind, back in these times, these countries would borrow money from one another. And if they were the losers of the war and they had no means of production, they had no way to pay each other back. And these were some of the forces that led to the Great Depression after World War I. Countries were in massive debt to one another and they had no way to pay each other back. And that led to a collapse of that sort of monetary system. So after the Great Depression, everybody was completely scarred, but they never really addressed the structural issues at that time. And so everyone just went back to actually trying a gold standard again. Fast forward a little bit, then World War II happens. And once World War II ended, countries were desperate to find a way to prevent there from being another Great Depression. All these countries are like, look, we're desperate to find a way to not have to go through another Great Depression. Like, what can we do? And the US said, hey, we'll offer a solution. They said, let us handle this, right? We will peg our currency to gold, the US dollar to gold, and then you can peg your currency to ours. And whenever you want gold, you can exchange dollars for gold. So countries actually agreed to this. They were like, look, we just don't want a Great Depression. So cool, we will keep our currencies within a narrow price range relative to the dollar. And we'll even intervene in foreign exchange markets to maintain stability when needed. And the agreement that was born out of this was called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And at this point, the dollar was now the world reserve currency. Okay, so central banks around the world were holding dollars, and trade was settled in dollars. And global finance revolved around US markets. And this gave the US structural privilege over the entire global financial system. But the thing about this was that now the US was in control of the monetary system because everything was pegged to the dollar. And so what could the US do? Well, while other countries needed to maintain gold and dollar reserves, the US could just issue dollars freely. And this was known as exorbitant privilege. But this also led to the Triffin dilemma, which is the concept where in order for the US to supply dollars to the world, the US has to run trade deficits, where essentially they buy more from other countries than they sell so that these other countries have dollars in their hands. And they have to print more dollars in order to keep this up. And the thing is if you keep printing dollars, then that kind of weakens confidence in the system. And especially when you have a gold-backed dollar, right? Well, if you keep printing money, then you're gonna have more dollars in circulation than you have gold reserves. And what happened in the late 1960s is that there was exactly that problem. You had more dollars existing than you had gold in US vaults. And countries, France, began to demand their gold back. And then in 1971, the system breaks. US President Richard Nixon closes the gold window and therefore ending convertibility of US dollars for gold. And that was the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that should have been when the dollar lost its dominance on the global stage. Because at this point, the dollar was backed by nothing other than the full faith and credit of the United States and was a completely fiat dollar. But instead, the US had a very clever plan, and they replaced gold with oil. So they developed a system to where oil all around the world would only be sold in US dollars. And how did they do that? Well, there was this organization called OPEC, and it's called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this is essentially an oil cartel. And it's an organization that enables the cooperation of the leading oil producing and oil dependent countries in order to collectively influence the global oil market and maximize profits. And the largest member of OPEC is this country called Saudi Arabia. Now, there was no public treaty about all of this that was called the petrodollar agreement, okay, but that's what the system was called, the petrodollar system. But instead, there was a series of understandings and institutional arrangements, most notably where Saudi Arabia agreed to price oil exclusively in US dollars and to invest surplus oil revenues into US treasuries and put their money in US banks and in US financial markets. And now, since Saudi Arabia was the largest member of OPEC, then once Saudi Arabia said that they would sell their oil in dollars, then essentially the whole system required dollar settlement. And so then every member of OPEC faced a real reality. If they wanted to sell oil at the market prices, then they needed to sell it in dollars. But what did Saudi Arabia get in return for this? Well, they got protection from the United States as far as military protection, guaranteed regional security, and they also would get support from their oil producers politically. So gold was now replaced by oil as the anchor of the value of the US dollar. And the reason this was so powerful is because the US has essentially forced demand for US dollars. Because remember, once the gold standard ended, there wasn't really a reason to use the dollar anymore. But if all of oil trade is priced in dollars and every country needs oil, and demand for oil is essentially inelastic, meaning that you need oil for your entire economy to function no matter what the price of it is, then now you've created forced demand for US dollars. So now, once again, the US is in a position where it can run unlimited deficits, meaning it can just print money on and raise money on without any real consequences for that. Because the world needs dollars whether they think that they're valuable or not. Whereas on the other hand, if Japan, for instance, just started printing way too much money, well, people would stop using their currency as it lost value on the global market. But here we are now, where we have China and Russia who have had enough of the US's influence and bullying. For a decade, central banks around the world have been accumulating gold, almost as if they're preparing to go back to some sort of a gold standard to combat the US dollar. There was something massive that changed when Russia and Ukraine started going to war, and the US not only froze Russian assets, but they even seized them and said, we don't care that you've bought treasuries from us, we're going to take them back. And there's nothing that you can do about it. Because now the whole world knows that not only will the US bully everyone to try to use the dollar, but they'll even straight up seize the assets that you've bought from them. So while Russia and China have been hanging out in Latin America, developing roots for many years, things have been heating up regarding these BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other countries like Venezuela. And they're doing this because they're finding ways to circumvent the US dollar. This is why Venezuela is so important. Venezuela has the largest oil reserve in the world. And because of this, if countries want to get around the US dollar, this is going to be the most important place to have control over. Now, the Trump administration's moves have also come right after this massive rally that we had in the price of gold and silver. And this might be a part of what's happening, right? Because if these countries are hoarding gold to get around the US dollar and we're seeing the price of that catch up, right, then that means that their power is also increasing over the United States as they have some of the largest gold reserves as well. Now, in the background, we've been hearing about some US banks who have been shorting precious metals, potentially trying to keep a lid on the price of these assets. And some of them are apparently going insolvent trying to do this. And we see the Fed making these incredible injections of liquidity into markets and potentially saving these banks. So could we actually be seeing a full-on currency war happen right before our eyes to the precious metal markets? And if so, this might have to do with the real reason that the US is moving in on Venezuela right now. Because Venezuela has the largest oil reserves, but they also have large deposits of iron ore and silver underground as well. If the US plans to remain in power and keep the US dollar in the reserve currency status position, then the US needs to do one of two things. The US is either going to have to restore faith in a debt-based system or transition into a commodity-backed system faster and better than the BRICS nations. So how could they do that? Well, they could take control of oil in Venezuela and potentially neighboring countries by force. Use excess oil capacity to lower the cost of oil in the US and therefore provide room for the US economy to boom without hurting its citizens, while the US tries to improve its debt to GDP ratio by lowering interest rates and running the economy hot. And you need cheap oil so that you can do all of this without hurting your citizens through inflation. Keep the oil prices down and you won't get too much inflation. Or the US can just simply be taking control of massive oil and gold deposits to create its own new system, new bonds, right? Like a gold-backed bond, as Trump's previous Fed nominee, Judy Shelton, has been calling for. She's even called for this to happen on America's 250th celebration on July 4th, 2026. Now, let's also not forget what you said about going back to a gold standard regarding using technology to do so.
Would returning to a gold standard help the U.S. economy? Can you talk a little about your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say I don't see it so much as returning, but more of a back to the future. I like the idea of a gold standard. I mean, it could be used in a very cryptocurrency way.
Now, could a bit bond or some other form of digital currency system be how the U.S. saves itself from the world dumping U.S. treasuries and moving into a new monetary system? Time will tell. And none of what I'm saying is financial advice. Please do not take financial advice from a random guy walking around a park talking to a stick. But I will be positioning myself by continuing to keep my eye on precious metals such as gold and silver, and you better believe it, as well on crypto. We also want to keep our eyes on U.S. defense stocks. You've got the big ones that we all know about, and then you've also got the new tech guy on the block called Palantir. This year is going to bring a lot of things that we've never seen before, and we will definitely expect the same in financial markets. So with that said, what did I miss? What did I get completely wrong? Or how could I be looking at this differently? I'm Keith D. I'm here to talk everything money and markets. And if you got anything from this at all whatsoever, be sure to like and subscribe. And also, if you haven't already, be sure to check out my live show with Ben Levitt. It's called Memes and Markets. We go live every Tuesday and Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern, and we're talking about topics like this, as well as also where culture intersects with financial markets. Now, you should really join us there, because if you have questions about this conversation or anything else, you can totally come in there live and chat with us. So, first link in the description down below. Go subscribe to Memes and Markets, and I'll chat with you over there. Until next time, peace.